Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Friday, March 27th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. It is going to be a warm day in Riverside with a high temperature of 92.6 degrees and a low reaching 67.9 degrees. Make sure to stay hydrated as we head into the weekend. Looking at our top stories, we are going to dive into the legal standoff involving a federal judge and the Pentagon regarding the blacklisting of an artificial intelligence company. We are also examining the latest developments in the Gilgo Beach murder investigation and why authorities believe they are getting closer to a final resolution. Beyond these major stories, we will be covering several other headlines to keep you informed on everything happening today. All this and more on Alex's News. Stay tuned. We start this morning with a story that sits right at the intersection of artificial intelligence, national security, and corporate ethics. A federal judge in California has just blocked the Pentagon from blacklisting one of America's leading AI companies. Ethan has been following this one closely. Ethan, bring us up to speed.
So just yesterday, U.S. District Judge Rita Lynn in the Northern District of California issued a preliminary injunction. It temporarily stops the Department of Defense from labeling Anthropic, the San Francisco AI firm behind the Claude model, as a so-called supply chain risk. NPR and CBS News are both calling this a significant victory for Anthropic. Judge Lynn used some pretty strong language, describing the government's actions as, quote, arbitrary and capricious, end quote. It's a real rebuke of what the administration tried to do here.
For people who haven't been following this, what exactly did the administration try to do?
President Trump signed an executive order directing every federal agency to stop using Anthropic's products entirely. That came after the Pentagon formally designated Anthropic a supply chain risk under a federal statute. Now, as Pearl Cohen and Opinio Juris have both pointed out, that label has historically been reserved for foreign adversaries. We're talking about companies like Huawei, ZTE, and Kaspersky Lab. There is simply no precedent for slapping that label on a domestic, American-owned company over a contract disagreement.
So how did we get here? What started this whole fight?
It goes back to February when Anthropic was negotiating a $200 million defense contract. The Washington Post and The Guardian both reported that the trigger was a memo from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth titled Any Lawful Use. That memo required every AI provider to let the military use their technology for any purpose permitted under current law. Anthropic looked at that and said no, not without certain protections written into the contract.
What kind of protections were they pushing for?
Two big ones. First, Anthropic wanted an explicit ban on fully autonomous lethal weapons, meaning systems that could decide to use deadly force without meaningful human involvement. Second, they wanted a prohibition on mass domestic surveillance of American citizens. According to Tech Policy Press, the company was especially worried about the military using commercially acquired personal information to sidestep existing privacy laws. CEO Dario Amodei argued that frontier AI models simply aren't reliable enough yet for lethal autonomy.
And the Pentagon wasn't willing to include those red lines?
Not at all. Amodei also made the point that the phrase, any lawful use, is dangerously vague. Internal Pentagon policies on autonomous weapons, like DoD Directive 3000.09, can be changed by the administration without Congress ever weighing in. So Anthropic's position was that contractual safeguards needed to exist independently of whatever the government decides its own rules are. When they wouldn't budge on that, negotiations fell apart, and the retaliation began.
You mentioned Judge Lynn used the word Orwellian. What exactly did she mean by that?
In her 43-page ruling, she wrote that the government essentially tried to brand a U.S. company as a saboteur, simply for disagreeing with procurement terms. NPR reported that the judge viewed it as, quote, classic First Amendment retaliation, end quote, designed to, quote, cripple, end quote, Anthropic's business. And it wasn't just about losing one federal contract. The supply chain risk designation also barred third-party contractors from working with Anthropic, Business Insider reported that could have cost the company billions in lost revenue.
So while Anthropic was being shut out, who stepped in to fill the gap?
OpenAI, Anthropic's biggest competitor. The Pentagon signed a major deal with OpenAI shortly after Anthropic was blacklisted. But that decision set off a firestorm of its own. Business Insider and the Robot Report detailed what became known as the Quit GPT movement. An estimated 1.5 million users uninstalled ChatGPT in early March to protest the military contract. It was a viral campaign that put real public pressure on OpenAI's leadership.
Did that pressure actually change anything at OpenAI?
It did. One of the most notable consequences was the resignation of OpenAI's robotics hardware lead, Caitlin Kalinowski. She publicly cited concerns over, quote, lethal autonomy without human authorization, end quote. After that, OpenAI went back and renegotiated its Pentagon contract. They added a cloud-only deployment clause, which prevents the AI from being installed directly on drone hardware. They also added what's called a static standard clause, which locks current ethical prohibitions in place even if the government later changes its own rules.
That sounds like it addresses some of the same concerns Anthropic raised. Is there a meaningful difference?
There is, and it's an important one. Just Security and India Times both point out that OpenAI's guardrails are still tied to the Pentagon's lawful use framework. Anthropic, on the other hand, insisted on independent contractual bans that the government could never bypass by simply rewriting its own internal regulations. So the distinction really comes down to who controls the safety switch. With OpenAI, the government retains more leverage. With Anthropic's model, the company keeps that authority.
Were there any surprises in who came out to support Anthropic in court?
Quite a few, actually. The court received amicus briefs from a really diverse coalition. Microsoft and several tech trade groups filed in support because they're worried the supply chain risk label could be weaponized against any company that pushes back on contract terms. The ACLU and a group of retired military leaders raised constitutional concerns. And here's one that caught a lot of people off guard. The Houston Chronicle reported that a group of Catholic theologians also filed a brief raising ethical objections to autonomous warfare. It's not every day you see that kind of alliance in a federal courtroom.
What about the government's argument? What was the DOJ actually claiming in court?
The Department of Justice argued that Anthropic's adversarial posture during negotiations suggested a risk of future sabotage, or even the activation of so-called kill switches. But NPR reported a pretty damaging detail for the government's case. The Pentagon had been sending cordial, friendly emails to Anthropic's leadership just days before publicly branding them a national security threat. Judge Lin clearly found that contradiction hard to square with claims of imminent danger.
So where does this all stand legally as of this morning?
It's playing out on two separate legal tracks right now. In California, Judge Lin's preliminary injunction is under a 7-day stay to give the DOJ time to appeal to the Ninth Circuit. If the appellate court doesn't grant its own stay, the supply chain risk label has to come off by early April. Meanwhile, there's a second lawsuit in the D.C. Circuit. According to Lawfare Media and the Washington Examiner, that case focuses on whether the Pentagon misapplied the Federal Acquisition Supply Chain Security Act by targeting a domestic company. That's a more technical statutory argument, but it could have huge implications.
Even if Anthropic wins on all fronts, does that mean the Pentagon has to actually use their products?
No, and that's a key point. The injunction prevents the government from blacklisting Anthropic, but it doesn't force anyone to buy their technology. The Houston Chronicle and KOAT both report the military can still turn to other providers, like OpenAI or Elon Musk's xAI, both of which have accepted the all-lawful use mandate. So Anthropic could win the legal battle and still lose the business. This is really about whether the government can weaponize national security labels to punish companies for their ethical positions.
Is there a bigger global picture here too?
Absolutely. The United Nations is currently pushing for a global treaty to ban fully autonomous weapons by the end of this year, according to UN.org. So this case isn't happening in a vacuum. It's becoming a critical domestic checkpoint in the broader conversation about who gets to govern artificial intelligence and what limits should exist on lethal autonomy. The outcome here could shape how governments and AI companies negotiate these boundaries for years to come.
A really consequential story, and one we'll clearly be following for a while. Ethan, thank you for walking us through all of that.
Happy to do it.
We've got one more story ahead, so stay with us. We turn now to a major development in one of the most notorious serial killer cases in American history. The Gilgo Beach investigation on Long Island has taken a dramatic turn. Chloe has been following this story closely, so let's bring her in. Chloe, what's happening with this case?
Grace, after years of insisting he was innocent, Rex Heuermann is expected to plead guilty to murdering 7 women. Newsday and NBC News both report that the 62-year-old former Manhattan architect will formally change his plea during a court hearing on April 8th, about 12 days from now. A plea deal has reportedly been worked out between Suffolk County District Attorney Ray Tierney and Heuermann's defense attorney, Michael Brown. If accepted, it would mean life in prison without any possibility of parole.
So this would replace the trial that was supposed to start later this year?
Exactly. A high-profile trial had been scheduled for September 2026. But according to sources cited by both Newsday and NBC News, neither side will be going to court now. The families of the victims have already been notified, and so has Heuermann's own family. Legal experts told the Associated Press he could theoretically change his mind before State Supreme Court Justice Timothy Mazzei formally accepts the plea. But at this point, everyone involved expects it to go through.
Remind listeners how far back these crimes go, because this isn't just about the bodies found in 2010.
That's a really important point. The 7 murders Heuermann is pleading guilty to span from 1993 all the way to 2011. Most people remember the so-called Gilgo 4, the women found in 2010 wrapped in burlap near each other along Ocean Parkway. Those were Melissa Barthelemy, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Amber Lynn Costello, and Megan Waterman. All 4 were involved in sex work, and their discovery is what blew this case wide open. But CBS News and NBC News report that forensic advances since his arrest in July 2023 connected him to 3 additional victims whose deaths go back much further.
Who are those 3 additional victims?
The earliest is Sandra Castilla, who was killed in 1993. Her inclusion pushed the timeline of Heuermann's alleged crimes back more than 30 years. Then there's Valerie Mack, previously known only as Jane Doe No. 6, who was killed around 2000, and Jessica Taylor, whose death came in 2003. Both Mack and Taylor had remains found in multiple locations, some discovered years apart. That pattern of scattering remains made it incredibly difficult to piece this together for a long time.
How did investigators finally build a case strong enough to make Heuermann plead?
Prosecutors have described the evidence as a blueprint for murder, and that's not just a figure of speech. According to Newsday and the Associated Press, the case really turned on DNA breakthroughs. Surveillance teams followed Heuermann in Manhattan and recovered a discarded pizza crust from a trash can. That crust provided DNA that matched a hair found on one of the victims. In late 2025, a judge ruled that mitochondrial DNA evidence admissible, which was a huge blow to the defense.
Was there more beyond the DNA?
Much more, and this is where it gets chilling. When authorities searched Heuermann's home in Massapequa Park, they found a digital file labeled HK 2002-04. U.S. News & World Report describes it as a meticulous checklist for carrying out killings. It included notes on how to limit noise, how to clean bodies, and how to destroy evidence afterward. On top of that, cell phone records placed Heuermann in direct contact with several victims shortly before they vanished. His internet history revealed thousands of searches related to violent torture pornography and frequent check-ins on the Gilgo Beach investigation itself.
I recall there was also something about a vehicle linking him to one of the disappearances.
That's right. A witness in the 2010 disappearance of Amber Costello reported seeing a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche near the scene. Detectives later confirmed that Hoyerman owned that exact model at the time. When you stack all of this together, the DNA, the digital blueprint, the phone records, the vehicle, it becomes clear why prosecutors called it a mountain of evidence. And it's likely a big reason the defense ultimately agreed to negotiate a plea rather than face a jury.
Now, more than 11 sets of remains were found along Ocean Parkway over the years. Are all of those cases tied to Hoyerman?
No, and that's a really crucial distinction. The plea covers 7 victims, but several other cases have actually been separated from Hoyerman entirely. The Washington Post and Fox News report that one of the biggest developments came in April 2025, when the remains known as Peaches and Baby Doe were identified as 26-year-old Tanya Denise Jackson and her 2-year-old daughter Tatiana Marie Dykes. Then, in December 2025, Andrew Dykes, the child's biological father, was arrested and charged with both murders. Authorities say that was a case of domestic violence, completely unrelated to the serial killer investigation.
What about the victim known as Asian Doe?
That case remains a real mystery. This victim was a biological male of Han Chinese descent who was found in women's clothing. The person has never been identified. NPR and WSHU report that as of this month, investigators are using microbial DNA testing, which involves analyzing soil and bacteria samples to try to determine where the victim lived before his death in 2006. It's cutting-edge forensic work, but they still don't have a name or a suspect.
And then there's Shannon Gilbert, the woman whose disappearance essentially launched the entire Gilgo Beach search.
Right, and she's notably absent from this plea deal. Shannon Gilbert vanished in 2010, and the frantic search for her is what led police to stumble upon the remains along Ocean Parkway. Her death is still officially classified as undetermined. Her family has never accepted that and continues to push in court to have it reclassified as a homicide. There's also Karen Vergata, who was identified in 2023 as the Fire Island Jane Doe. She disappeared in 1996, and while her case is still active, no formal charges have been filed against Hoyerman as of today.
Hoyerman's defense team tried to point the finger at other people during the proceedings. Did any of that gain traction?
Not really. The defense attempted to name what they called alternative suspects, including former Suffolk County Police Chief James Burke. But NBC News notes that no evidence was ever released linking Burke or anyone else to these specific murders. One particular back and forth involved a black leather belt found at a crime scene with the initials WH stamped on it. The defense argued it could refer to an officer. WH prosecutors maintained it referred to the Hoyerman family name. In the end, the defense's efforts to redirect blame didn't undermine the prosecution's case.
This has clearly devastated Hoyerman's own family, too.
It absolutely has. His daughter, Victoria Hoyerman, appeared in a 2025 documentary on Peacock and made a remarkable statement. She said she believes her father, quote, most likely, end quote, committed the crimes after reviewing the evidence herself. That's his own child, publicly acknowledging his guilt before he even entered this plea. His estranged wife, Asa Ellerup, finalized their divorce in March 2025 and relocated the family to South Carolina to escape the intense public scrutiny. It's hard to overstate how this case has torn that family apart.
For the victims, families, what does this plea actually mean in practical terms?
It means they won't have to sit through a graphic, months-long trial reliving the worst moments of their lives. That was a real concern, because the evidence in this case involves extremely disturbing details. A guilty plea on April 8th would bring a measure of finality that some of these families have been waiting more than 3 decades to receive. It also guarantees Hoyerman stays behind bars for the rest of his life, which removes any uncertainty a jury trial might have introduced.
And the broader investigation continues for the cases not covered by this plea.
It does. Suffolk County authorities have made clear that the work isn't over. The identities of some victims are still unknown, and cases like Asian Doe, Shannon Gilbert, and Karen Vergata remain open. The forensic technology that helped crack this case is still being applied to those unsolved remains. So while April 8th may close the chapter on 7 of these murders, Gilgo Beach still has secrets that investigators are determined to uncover.
A case that's haunted Long Island for decades is finally approaching something resembling resolution. Chloe, thank you for walking us through all of that.
Thanks, Grace.
Here are some other headlines. The Israeli military has taken its campaign to new heights, launching a massive wave of airstrikes targeting the heart of Tehran early Friday morning. These strikes specifically hammered ballistic missile production sites and weapon storage facilities in western Iran, just as the conflict enters its 28th day. This escalation comes shortly after President Donald Trump gave Tehran more breathing room by extending a self-imposed deadline to April 6th for the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Despite the president's claim that ceasefire negotiations are going swimmingly, Iranian officials have been quick to pour cold water on those reports. Meanwhile, the Associated Press has officially labeled the ground operations in southern Lebanon an invasion as thousands of troops attempt to seize territory south of the Litani River. With the Strait of Hormuz effectively closed, global energy markets are having a bit of a meltdown, forcing New Zealand into emergency fuel rationing, while Group of 7 leaders warn that Iran is holding the global economy hostage. The humanitarian toll is staggering, with the United Nations reporting over 82,000 civilian buildings damaged in Iran and a combined death toll exceeding 3,000 across both Iran and Lebanon. In the Golden State, Riverside County Sheriff Chad Bianco is finding himself in a paper jam after defending the seizure of more than 600,000 ballots from the November 2025 special election. Bianco claims this fact-finding mission into Proposition 50 is just normal law enforcement, but critics say he is really pushing the envelope. While a local integrity group alleged a discrepancy of 45,000 votes, the county registrar maintains the certified results were accurate within roughly 100 votes. Attorney General Rob Bonta and the UCLA Voting Rights Project have filed lawsuits to halt the hand count, arguing the sheriff is flagrantly violating state law. This is the first time a California sheriff has seized ballots en masse, creating a constitutional clash that might leave the June 2026 primary in a state of suspended animation. South of the border, a massive oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico is creating a crude reality for local wildlife. The spill has spread over 600 kilometers, or 373 miles, contaminating 7 protected nature reserves and 200 kilometers of coastline. While the Navy Secretary blamed the mess on illegal dumping and natural seeps, Pemex is still under a microscope for its own infrastructure failures. Local activists have documented the deaths of sea turtles, dolphins, and manatees, proving that this disaster is a real shell shock for the ecosystem that has damaged 17 coral reefs. The government has collected 430 tons of hydrocarbons so far, but the transparency crisis is still leaking into the administration's reputation. In the world of tech, social media giants are finding that their algorithms are finally catching up to them. Kimberly Osterman, who lost her 18-year-old son Max in 2021 to a fentanyl-laced pill, is celebrating a landmark legal victory. A Los Angeles jury found Meta and YouTube liable for negligence, awarding $6 million to a 20-year-old plaintiff in a trial that suggests these platforms have been scrolling toward trouble for years. This follows a $375 million verdict in New Mexico over child protection violations. These cases are a total game-changer, as they bypass traditional Section 230 protections by focusing on the addictive design of the sites. Over 1,600 lawsuits are currently pending, and while Meta and Google plan to appeal, the legal feed is just getting started. Finally, the Senate has decided to stop the clock on a 41-day partial shutdown of the Department of Homeland Security. In a pre-dawn voice vote on Friday, March 27th, lawmakers passed a funding package to keep the TSA, Coast Guard, and FEMA afloat through the end of the fiscal year. However, they decided to put enforcement funding on ice, pointedly excluding new appropriations for ICE and Customs and Border Protection. Democrats argued it was time to stop giving a blank check to agencies following a fatal shooting in Minneapolis. While this helps federal workers get their back pay, it leaves the most contentious border policies up in the air as the bill heads to the House of Representatives. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with Claude Opus 4.6, Gemini Pro 3.1, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.